was never much for old tales, the kind whispered in barbershops and carried down smoky tavern halls, but there are some stories that cling to you whether you want them or not. Growing up in Ohio, I used to hear fragments of the one about the vanished men, 30 construction workers who simply disappeared during the bleakest years of the Great Depression. It was said they were part of a road crew hired under some private contract in 1932 when jobs were scarce and men would do anything for a week's worth of bread and coal. They left for work one bitter morning and never came back, not a trace of them found, not a single nail or boot print left behind. I was a boy then, too young to make sense of the rumors, but old enough to feel the shadow of mystery every time my father and the older men grew quiet around a poker table or turned down the volume of the radio when the subject slipped into conversation. The story was treated like a family heirloom nobody wanted but couldn't throw away. Years rolled on, and the Depression became history books, photographs, and the weary eyes of survivors who lived long enough to tell how hunger sharpened the soul and how whole families vanished beneath the weight of dust and poverty. But this tale, the Vanished 30, was different. It didn't appear in newspapers or government reports. It was carried instead in oral tradition, in warnings spoken low, as if even the air should not be trusted to carry it. My father used to tell me, "Don't ask about those men, son. Best let ghosts stay ghosts." And so I didn't. At least, not while he lived. But when I became a man, with a life of my own and my father gone into the earth, I found myself unable to resist the lure of it. Not out of morbid fascination, but because the older I grew, the more I realized how fragile memory is, and how easily entire pieces of the past can be erased if no one bothers to keep them alive. My first encounter with the story as something real rather than rumor came in 1997. I was helping an old neighbor, Mr. Dwyer, clean out his garage. He had been a machinist in his day, a wiry man with sharp knuckles and the sort of suspicion in his eyes that came from surviving too many broken promises. He was well into his 80s, body frail, but mind quick as ever. The garage was a sagging structure, added onto the side of his property sometime in the 1940s, its wooden beams bowed and nails rusting in the damp air. We'd hauled out boxes of old tools, coffee cans stuffed with screws, yellowed magazines with Rosie the Riveter on the covers, when my crowbar slipped into a crack in the back wall. At first, I thought it was just the drywood giving way. But when I pried deeper, a hollow sound echoed, a cavity where there shouldn't have been one. Dwyer leaned close, his breath wheezing. "Careful with that," he said, but his eyes betrayed something more than caution. It was recognition, maybe even dread. With enough effort, we pulled away a loose panel of wood and exposed a narrow compartment behind the wall, barely wide enough for a man to crawl through. Dust billowed, filling our lungs and stinging our eyes, but inside the cavity, stacked neatly as if arranged by deliberate hands, were objects that froze me to the marrow. Helmets, rusted but unmistakably the kind issued to construction crews in the early 1930s. Jackets, brittle with age, their cloth eaten by moths yet still bearing patches with numbers stitched into them. And beneath these relics, wrapped in oilcloth, were journals, tools, and even what looked like a half-used payroll ledger. Dwyer slumped against the wall when he saw them, muttering words I could barely understand, something about them poor men. I didn't know it then, but that discovery in the garage would consume the next years of my life. It wasn't just the shock of finding objects that had no business being hidden there. It was the realization that the old story was not some drunken yarn. There had been 30 men. They had vanished. And somehow, their trace had been buried in a compartment just a few feet from where I stood. Dwyer refused to speak of it afterward. He wouldn't touch the items, wouldn't let me take them at first, but I managed to convince him that history demanded preservation. He gave in, reluctantly, warning me once more, "Some things don't want to be dug up." I told myself it was just the mutterings of a weary man afraid of stirring up the past. But even as I carried the helmets and journals into my truck, I felt the same invisible weight that must have silenced the men of my father's generation. That night, I sat in my study and unwrapped the journals. The paper was delicate, edges curled, ink faded, but the handwriting was still legible. The name Samuel Fitch appeared inside the first cover, a man I would later confirm had been listed on municipal payroll records in 1932. His entries began with the ordinary. Notes about long days digging foundations, pouring concrete, handling dynamite for blasting. He wrote of men who were starving but grateful for work, men who had left families behind, men who joked and sang even with stomachs empty. Yet as the entries progressed, a darker thread wove its way through his words. He wrote of strange orders from supervisors no one ever saw, of being sent into wooded land miles from any mapped project, of camps set up in valleys where compasses spun uselessly and the birds grew silent at dusk. He wrote of men waking in the night to screams, of shadows moving where no one stood, of something beneath the soil that did not want to be disturbed. I must have read those journals until dawn, the words rattling around in my chest. They were not the scrawlings of a lunatic. They were methodical, steady, as though Fitch was struggling to make sense of what he himself could hardly believe. By morning, I knew I couldn't turn away. I had stumbled upon the first thread of a tapestry that had been hidden for 6 decades. And like it or not, I was already entangled in it. The days that followed felt like stepping into a current too strong to fight, as if the discovery in Dwyer's garage had pulled me into waters long waiting to drag someone under. I carried the journals with me everywhere, flipping through them on lunch breaks, late at night, even in the quiet hours before dawn when the world seemed most willing to whisper secrets. What struck me most was the detail Fitch had preserved, the names of his fellow workers, the measurements of the trenches they dug, the songs they sang to drown out fatigue. These were not abstractions. These were men with sweat in their brows, with families waiting by stoves that had long gone cold. Their lives breathed on the pages, and yet the last entries descended into such terror that I found myself pausing, staring at the ink, wondering what kind of silence had pressed itself upon them that final week. By the second journal, it became clear that something deliberate had happened. The ledger matched names to wages, but the payments had stopped abruptly, midweek, without explanation. Fitch had written that their foreman, a man identified only as Mr. Hale, received orders from suits, who never introduced themselves and rarely spoke in more than gestures. The crew had been moved from one site to another, always deeper into unmarked land, always told it was for infrastructure expansion. But Fitch wrote plainly, "We are building nothing. We are digging, always digging, into soil that should not be touched." At first I assumed it was metaphorical, the ravings of exhaustion. But the entries grew consistent, backed by testimony of other men's fears. They spoke of an unnatural hum in the ground, of tools vibrating in their hands, of animals fleeing the sites long before the crew even arrived. The more I read, the more I felt I was trespassing. And yet I could not stop. I began to dig into local archives, the kind most people ignore, the county records written in thick, dusty ledgers. That's when I confirmed that in the early months of 1932, a contract had been filed by a private consortium to fund auxiliary roadway expansion. The paperwork listed 30 hired men, their names nearly identical to those Fitch had scribbled. But here was the first anomaly. The project was never completed, and no official record explained why. By fall of that same year, the document ceased, the payrolls ended, and the consortium itself dissolved into shadow. I traced names where I could, census records, church registries, obituaries. Each line ended abruptly, as though the men had simply vanished from the earth, their families left to starve, to remarry, or to leave the state in search of a better life. No paper trail of pension, no burial certificates, nothing. I returned again and again to Dwyer's garage, pressing him with questions. At first he resisted, telling me that some things were meant to rot with time. But old men, when they know their end is near, have a way of loosening their grip on secrets. One evening, under the flicker of his weak bulb, he told me what he remembered as a boy. He had lived near the worksite, only 10 or 11 years old, and he recalled the trucks, dark, unmarked, carrying men with shovels and blasting gear. He remembered the smell of dynamite, the groan of earth being split. But most of all, he remembered the silence after it stopped. One day they were there, he whispered, and the next gone. My father told me never to mention it again, said we'd starve if I asked questions. His voice trembled when he said the workers had been warned by townsfolk not to dig in that valley, not because of superstition, but because of something buried there before we ever came along. That phrase lodged in me. Something buried there. I became obsessed with finding the site itself. Fitch's journals, though cryptic, offered clues, mentions of streams, of ridges shaped like a bent arm, of a tree line cut in the form of a sickle. I pored over county maps, tracing every contour, until I stumbled upon a valley 20 miles out, long since abandoned, where an unmarked dirt road disappeared into thicket. One Saturday I drove out alone, the journals on the seat beside me, the autumn air sharp with a scent of drying leaves. The road grew narrower until my truck could barely squeeze through. Finally, I reached a clearing, its soil black as though charred. Birds circled high, but none dared land. The place felt unnatural, as though sound itself was thinner there. I stepped into the clearing and felt a vibration beneath my boots. It was faint, like the echo of machinery buried deep below. No ruin stood, no foundations, no leftover scaffolding or tools. Only earth that looked turned over and left to harden with time. But I knew, as surely as I knew my own name, that this was the place Fitch had written of. I crouched low, running my fingers through the soil. The dirt was oddly warm, even though the air was cold enough to mist my breath. A shard of rusted metal jutted from the ground, the edge of what looked like a shovel's blade. And nearby, half hidden by weeds, was a chunk of concrete with rebar curling out like veins, broken and blackened. I don't know how long I stayed there, crouched like a trespasser in some forbidden temple. But eventually I heard it, faint at first, then clearer. A hum, low and rhythmic, pulsing through the earth. It was not mechanical, it was not natural either. It felt alive, like the steady throb of a buried heart. I stumbled back, shaking, clutching Fitch's journal to my chest. For the first time since opening those pages, I understood why my father, Dwyer, and all the others had kept silent. This was not just a story of lost men. This was a story of something unearthed, something better left forgotten, something those 30 men had awakened and never lived to tell about. I drove home that evening with hands trembling on the wheel, but the worst was yet to come. For when I returned, I found that the journals were not as I had left them. New markings had appeared in the margins, faint, as if scrawled in haste. Words I did not remember seeing before. Words that read, "It watches still. It remembers." For days after discovering that valley, I could not escape the feeling that something had followed me home. It wasn't paranoia in the ordinary sense. It was subtler, like a shadow bending just out of view or a silence falling too abruptly in the middle of an otherwise normal day. The journals stayed locked in my desk drawer, but I swore I could hear the faint scratch of pen on paper when the house was quiet, as though words were still being written in their margins long after Fitch's hand had stilled. Sleep came only in fragments, and when it did, it carried with it dreams of tunnels, endless tunnels burrowed into black earth, with men's voices echoing ahead of me, calling for water, for light, for help that never reached them. I would wake with sweat dripping down my spine, the sheets twisted like ropes, the echo of the hum from the valley still pressing against my eardrums. It was in the midst of those nights that I began piecing together the fragments of the men's last days. Fitch's journal had broken off mid-sentence, but the ledger and scraps of notes tucked in the oilcloth filled in some of the gaps. The 30 workers had been ordered to dig into a hillside without explanation, tunneling deeper day by day. There had been whispers among them that they were searching for something buried, gold, perhaps, or remnants of some lost industrial project. But Fitch's tone made it clear that whatever they unearthed was not wealth. His words grew frantic, pages stained with dirt, and something darker, perhaps blood. "We have gone too deep," one note read. "The ground shudders as if alive. Hale says keep digging. We dare not refuse." And then, the final fragment. "If these pages are found, tell them we did not vanish. We were taken." The word taken sat with me, gnawed at me, until I sought answers beyond the scope of county records. I drove to the state capitol, pouring through archives so long neglected that the staff seemed surprised anyone still cared about them. There I uncovered something chilling, a sealed file labeled under Infrastructure Anomalies, 1932. The clerk hesitated before sliding it toward me, muttering that he'd never seen anyone request it before. Inside were scattered reports, and signed and incomplete, describing unexplained seismic activity in the county the workers had vanished. One report suggested the vibrations resembled mining explosions, but another warned they bore organic rhythms inconsistent with mechanical disturbance. The file ended abruptly, no conclusions drawn, only a recommendation to discontinue all state interest in the area. Someone had deliberately buried the matter, just as someone had built that hidden compartment in Dwyer's garage. I drove home from the capital with dread riding shotgun. My mind kept circling back to Dwyer, how he had slumped against the wall when he first saw the helmets, how his voice cracked when he muttered about them poor men. I realized then that his silence had not been cowardice, but survival. He knew what lingered beneath that valley. He knew because he had seen the aftermath as a boy, and maybe, just maybe, he had carried some memory darker than he had let slip. That night, I returned to his house with the journals. I placed them before him, demanded the truth. For a long time, he sat silent, the clock ticking like a heartbeat. Then, with the resignation of a man too old to carry the burden any longer, he spoke. They weren't supposed to dig there, he said softly. The elders warned them. My father warned them. That land had been cursed long before any of us were born. Folks said it belonged to the earth itself, not to men. But hunger makes fools of us all. 30 men went in, and not one came back. The next week, the ground shook so hard our windows cracked. My mother said she heard voices in the soil, wailing as though the men were buried alive, but still calling. The suits came after, told everyone to keep quiet, paid off who they could, threatened the rest. They said it was better for us all if the world forgot. He looked me dead in the eye then, and I'll never forget the emptiness in his gaze. Boy, you should have left those journals where they lay. Once you know, it doesn't let you go. I wanted to dismiss it as superstition, the ramblings of an old man, but deep down, I knew he was right. I was already entangled, already marked by what I had seen and heard. And the proof came the following week. I was in my study when the lights flickered, the hum of the valley echoing faintly through the floorboards as though my house itself had been wired to its pulse. Papers rustled, without wind. The journals slid open on their own. On one page, scrawled in handwriting that was not Fitch's, appeared the words, 30 men, 30 shadows. We are still here. I slammed the book shut, heart pounding, and fled the room. But there is no fleeing something that has already woven itself into your life. From that moment on, I knew the vanished workers were not gone in the way history had told us. They lingered, trapped in some chasm between worlds, their voices carried in vibrations, their presence bleeding into the edges of places where no one dares go. And now, through those journals, through me, their story was clawing its way back into the light. The more I tried to resist, the more the story pulled me deeper, as though the vanished 30 had chosen me as their mouthpiece. My waking hours became as haunted as my nights. At work, I would hear the distant sound of hammers and picks, though no one else seemed to notice. In the grocery store, I would glimpse men in tattered work jackets, their faces gaunt, their eyes hollow, only to blink and see nothing but strangers filling their carts. The world around me had not changed, yet I had. I carried the weight of the vanished crew like iron shackles, and everywhere I turned, the world seemed to whisper pieces of their unfinished tale. One evening, driven by desperation more than courage, I returned to the valley. This time, I brought tools, flashlight, crowbar, even a spade, though I had no clear idea of what I intended to do. The air was heavier than before, the soil giving off a faint heat as if the valley itself was exhaling. I traced the ground, searching for any sign of the tunnels Fitch described, until my foot caught against a depression in the earth. Brushing away the weeds, I uncovered a circular slab of concrete, its surface cracked but intact, with rusted bolts securing its edges. A hatch or a seal. My hands shook as I pried at it with the crowbar. At first, it would not budge, as though the earth itself resisted. But then, with a groan that rattled my bones, the slab shifted, and a foul gust of air burst upward, hot and damp, carrying with it the unmistakable stench of decay. Beneath lay a shaft, descending into blackness. The beam of my flashlight pierced only a few feet before being swallowed whole. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to reseal the hatch and never return. But another part of me, the part that had read Fitch's words and heard Dwyer's trembling confession, knew this was the threshold of truth. I climbed down, boots scraping against the damp metal rungs of a ladder that groaned under my weight. The air grew warmer with every step, thick with the smell of rust and rot. When I reached the bottom, the beam of my flashlight revealed a tunnel, its walls lined not with brick or stone, but with earth reinforced by beams that had long since splintered. Tools lay abandoned in the dirt, shovels, pickaxes, wheelbarrows, rusted relics frozen mid-task, as if their owners had dropped them in sudden panic. I walked deeper, my footsteps echoing. Strange markings scored the walls, scratches that looked at first like the desperate clawing of men, but upon closer inspection, seemed deliberate, almost symbols. Circles intersected by jagged lines, crude depictions of figures with limbs stretched impossibly long. And the deeper I went, the stronger the hum became. It wasn't a sound anymore. It was a pressure, vibrating in my chest, rattling my teeth, a living pulse that seemed to come from the very bones of the earth. Then I saw it, a cavern opening wide, its ceiling lost in shadow, its floor littered with helmets and scraps of cloth. And scattered among them were bones. Human bones, some half-buried, some arranged in patterns that made no sense to the human mind. I stumbled forward, the beam of my flashlight trembling, and that's when I saw them. At the far edge of the cavern stood figures, not flesh, not quite shadow, but something in between. 30 of them, give or take, their outlines flickering like smoke, their eyes burning faintly with a light that was not of this world. They did not move, not in the way men move. They swayed, as though tethered to invisible strings, their mouths opening and closing in silence. My breath caught in my throat. These were the vanished workers, or what was left of them, suspended between worlds, chained to whatever they had unearthed. And as I watched, their voices came, not in sound, but in my skull, 30 overlapping whispers merging into one. We dug too deep. We woke it. We cannot leave. I dropped my flashlight. Darkness swallowed me, broken only by the faint glow of their eyes. Blind panic surged, and I scrambled back through the tunnel, the hum rising to a roar, the earth quaking beneath me as though the cavern itself sought to close around me. Somehow, I clawed my way up the ladder, slamming the hatch shut behind me. When I stumbled into the night air, gasping, I found the valley silent once more, as if nothing had stirred at all. Yet I knew better. I had seen them. I had felt their torment. The 30 were still there, bound in the black belly of the earth, and now their secret lived in me. For weeks afterward, I told no one. Who would believe me? To speak of it would brand me mad, the kind of man who saw ghosts and shadows. But silence carried its own punishment. The workers haunted me in waking visions, their hollow faces flickering in the corners of my sight, their whispers urging me to finish their story. Dwyer died not long after, taking with him whatever final truths he had kept. At his funeral, I looked at the faces of the old townsfolk and wondered how many of them had known, how many had chosen silence over madness. I envied them, for ignorance was a kind of mercy I no longer possessed. It was then I realized the journals, the artifacts, even my memories of the valley were no longer mine to hoard. They belonged to the story itself, a story the vanished 30 demanded be told. And whether I liked it or not, I had become the last witness, the only living man who could drag their truth out of the earth and into the light. Once the decision to tell their story took hold, my life began unraveling in ways I could not control. It wasn't just the visions anymore, it was the world itself bending around the weight of the 30. Street lamps flickered when I walked beneath them. Radios crackled with bursts of static that resolved into the faint clang of pickaxes, the shuffle of boots on stone. Even strangers began to notice. A cashier once paused mid-sentence, her eyes unfocused, and whispered, "Don't dig any deeper," though when I asked what she meant, she blinked and claimed she'd said nothing at all. The boundary between the ordinary and the haunted had thinned so much that I could no longer tell which side I walked upon. It was then I resolved to trace the origins of this curse, for lack of a better word. If the 30 had been taken, then by what? Fitch's journals hinted at something older than industry, something buried in the land long before men arrived with shovels and dynamite. The markings in the tunnel, the symbols etched into the walls, were my only clue. I took photographs of them during my frantic escape, blurry but distinct enough to study. I brought them to a professor of anthropology at the university, a man named Dr. Roth who specialized in pre-Columbian cultures of the region. He examined them under the harsh light of his office, his brow furrowing deeper with each passing minute. Finally, he pushed the photos back toward me. "These aren't indigenous," he said. "At least not in any way I've ever seen. They're older, cruder, but deliberate. If I didn't know better, I'd say they weren't meant for worship, but for warning." He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. Whatever those men dug into, it wasn't just earth. It was a threshold, and thresholds are never meant to be crossed. He refused to speak further, his hands trembling slightly as he locked the office door behind me. His fear only confirmed what I already suspected. The vanished workers had unearthed something ancient, something alive in ways we could not comprehend. But what haunted me most was not the thing itself, it was their fate. To be trapped in that cavern, their forms dissolved into shadow, their voices bound to the hum of the earth, was a torment I could not fathom. And yet, they had chosen to show themselves to me.
Why?
Why me, and not some historian or priest or scientist? The answer came one night, when the journals once again stirred on their own. Words appeared on the page, written in a hand that was neither Fitch's nor mine. "You opened the hatch.
You saw.
You carry us now." The realization struck me like a blow. By entering the cavern, by witnessing their half-existence, I had become their vessel, their tether to the living world. It wasn't just about telling their story, it was about carrying their burden, about ensuring that their suffering was not forgotten. And with that understanding came a crushing weight, one that pressed upon me until even my reflection in the mirror began to change. My face grew gaunt, my eyes hollow, my skin sallow, as though I too were being pulled toward that shadowed state. I began recording everything. Every dream, every vision, every flicker of their presence. My study became a shrine of sorts, littered with maps, notes, transcripts of the journals, and photographs of the valley. Sleep abandoned me altogether. I worked by candlelight, convinced that electricity only fed the hum that grew stronger with each passing week. Friends stopped visiting. My job slipped through my fingers. But I did not care. All that mattered was preserving their truth, weaving their fragments into a narrative strong enough to outlast me. Yet even as I wrote, the 30 pressed closer. I could feel them at night, gathered around my bed, their whispers a constant susurrus. Sometimes I would wake to find soil scattered across my floorboards, as though clumps of the valley had been dragged into my house. Other times I'd discover handprints in the dust, too large and twisted to belong to any living man. The barrier was failing. What lay beneath was seeping upward, and I was the conduit. And though terror consumed me, I knew there was no turning back. The journals had found me, the valley had marked me, and the 30 had chosen me. It was not faith, not courage, but inevitability that drove me to the conclusion. Their story would not end in silence, as the suits of 1932 had intended.
No.
I would drag it into the open, even if it destroyed me. For perhaps that was the only way to free them. Not with prayers or rituals, but with truth carved into words strong enough to defy the forgetting. And so I wrote, and so I bled myself onto the page, not as a historian, not as a savior, but as a man chained to 30 shadows who refused to rest. By the time the winter of that year settled in, I was no longer living a life of my own making. Everything revolved around the 30. Their presence shadowed me in every corner, and my house had become less a home than a mausoleum straining against the weight of restless spirits. Neighbors whispered that I'd gone mad. I saw their curtains twitch when I stepped outside, their children pulled closer as though proximity to me might stain them. Perhaps they were right to fear, for I carried in me the residue of the cavern, the mark of men who had not died but lingered in torment. Every day, I felt myself slipping further from the world of the living. The journals were no longer passive relics. Their pages turned on their own, ink seeping into margins as if unseen hands were still writing. Sometimes the words were clear, pleas for release, fragmented prayers. Other times, they were symbols, repeating the markings I had seen in the tunnel walls, scrawled so urgently that the paper tore. I tried burning one of the pages once, thinking to sever the connection, but the flames sputtered and died, leaving the paper untouched. That was the moment I stopped resisting. Whatever bound me to the 30 was beyond fire, beyond faith, beyond the rules of ordinary men. I was theirs now for as long as they demanded. And demand they did. Night after night, their whispers filled my ears, shaping my thoughts, guiding my pen. They showed me visions, not only of their final days, but of something older, something deeper. I saw men long before the 1930s, digging in the same valley, only to vanish as well. I saw crude tribes dragging offerings to the earth, throwing bones and blood into pits to appease what stirred beneath. I saw the land shifting through centuries, always hungry, always pulling down those foolish enough to pierce its skin. The 30 were not the first, nor would they be the last. They were simply the loudest chorus in a song that had been echoing since time immemorial. One night, I found myself drawn back to the valley, as though sleepwalking. I do not remember leaving my house, nor driving the long road. I remember only the bitter cold of the wind, and the way the trees leaned inward as if hurting me toward the clearing. The hatch was open, though I had sealed it. Soil spilled from its edges, and a faint glow pulsed from below, dim but steady, like a lantern deep underground. I should have fled, but my legs carried me down the ladder, once more, my mind half my own and half theirs. The cavern was alive with movement. Shadows writhed across the walls, their forms shifting between men and something less human. Helmets clinked as though stirred by invisible hands. The 30 stood waiting, their outlines sharper now, their eyes burning brighter. And in the center of the cavern rose something vast, a shape half buried in the earth, its surface ridged like bone, its size dwarfing any living thing I had ever seen. The workers' whispers flooded me all at once. We unearthed it. We fed it. Now we are bound. I realized then that they had not merely dug too deep. They had uncovered a relic of something that predated mankind, something that had waited in silence until their greed split the earth wide enough to breathe. I staggered backward, my body trembling, and that's when one of them stepped forward, Fitch himself, or what remained of him. His face was clearer than the rest, his eyes sorrowful, his mouth shaping words that pressed directly into my skull. Finish it.
Tell them.
Free us. His hand reached toward me, and though it was no longer flesh, I felt its chill burn against my skin. In that moment, I understood my role not as a witness alone, but as the vessel chosen to carry their agony into the world above. When I awoke, I was back in my bed, soil scattered across the sheets, my boots caked with mud. The hatch was no dream. The valley was no delusion. And the mark Fitch had burned into my skin remained, a faint imprint of a hand, black as coal, etched into my forearm. From that night forward, there would be no pretending, no silence, no escape. The 30 were with me, in me, urging me ever closer to the final act of their long-buried story. I would like to tell you that I walked into that cavern like a man with purpose and left like a hero, that I performed some tidy ritual and the 30 rose, whole and blinking, to reclaim their lives. The truth is messier and uglier and fits no legend neatly folded for the mantle. What happened in that last descent was the sum of everything I'd become: fear, stubbornness, guilt, and an odd sort of devotion to truth that felt almost religious. I had barricaded myself with maps and journals for weeks, cross-referencing every scrap of paper, every scrawled margin note, every whispered plea that had pressed against my ears like wind through a cracked window. I had convinced myself that if I could reconstruct their story completely, name by name, shovel by shovel, breath by breath, some balance might be restored. I would bear witness so thoroughly the earth would have no choice but to release them. It was a childish logic, and yet it was all I had. The valley was colder than I remembered, or else I had grown more sensitive to cold. The night sky was an iron plate overhead. I carried only the essentials: the journals wrapped in oilcloth, a small hammer, a coil of rope, and a flashlight that stuttered like a nervous thing. Friends had stopped answering my calls. The university refused to return my messages. Even the bar where I used to drink had a new owner who seemed determined never to ask questions. So I went alone, which is how the 30 had gone once. Alone in the sense that no policy, no law, no machine would come for them when they needed one. They had been ordinary men who answered for a job and were paid in oblivion. I had no right to ask for anything different of them now. I found the hatch open, as if it had been waiting, like a wound that could not quite close. The air that rose from below smelled of iron and old promises. The ladder creaked under my weight. The hum that had always been there settled into my bones like a second heartbeat. When the cavern opened into that vast, hungry space, it felt at once intimate and cosmic, like the throat of the world itself. The 30 stood as they had before, shadows with human shapes, helmets hung about them like broken crowns, and at their center the thing they had unearthed, ridges and plates that looked like bone and rock fused, a form too large to comprehend, threaded with veins of something that pulsed like molten metal. It was neither beast nor machine, but a concatenation of both, older than any name we would find in a book. It regarded me with the indifference of the ancient and the appetite of the living. They pressed their pleas into my chest. Fitch, if I can still call him Fitch, stepped forward, more solid than the rest, his voice a rasp that nonetheless carried with the clarity of someone who had practiced a single sentence for decades. Finish it. Tell the truth. Bury us no more. I had learned from the journals and the anthropologist and the hollow of my own nights that many thresholds have keys that are not locks. Stories, names, the care of remembrance. What they wanted, it seemed, was a narrative that matched the injustice, the naming of the suits who'd lied, the ledger entries that had been doctored, the towns paid off, the county files that were shelved and nailed shut. They wanted me to take those facts and make them public, to make the shame of it visible, so that whatever held them would be forced to answer for what it demanded. There was also something else, darker and more desperate. They wanted release. Not all of them, and not in the way most would imagine. Some whispered of going back to the earth wholly and finally, surrendering their fragmented selves so that the thing beneath might be starved of offerings. Others begged for a chance at breath and summer on a porch, at laughter and simple work again. I argued with them in my head, bargaining the only way I knew how, through compromise and ink. I told them I would fight the suits, that I would take the files to newspapers, the university, any judge with a backbone, but my voice seemed thin against the cavern's pulse. They had been betrayed by men with suits and sealed papers, and the law, I had learned, was porous when confronted by old hunger. So I fashioned a plan that might answer both needs, truth as a blade, story as a seal. I would write everything I knew, and then I would act where words could not reach. If some of them had to be offered, I would choose those the earth kept closest. If the choice could be made, I would bargain my own life for enough release to let the others go. That is the part of this tale that sits like a stone in my throat, the part where self becomes currency. I cannot pretend I was noble. My reasoning was an amalgam of selfishness and grace. Selfishness because I had grown to see this as my fate and thus wanted to control it. Grace because I could not bear their faces in my dreams forever. I descended into the cavern, the journals heavy in my pack, and I read to them aloud. I read the names, every name, their ages, the way they had laughed at small jokes on cold mornings, the detail of children and wives, and the thin patchwork of grocery lists and dreams. I read the ledger entries aloud, the signatures of men who had hired them and then folded their contracts into lies. I read accusations and citations until my voice cracked and bled, and the cavern absorbed every word like water through soil. The hum rose with every name, and I understood, with a clarity that was almost tender, that words could feed the place, too, if left untended and false. So I fed it truth instead. When I finished, a hush fell that felt like the inhalation before a great exhale. The thing at the center of that pit shifted, not with rage, but with attention, as though it had been waiting to be spoken to in a language it recognized. And then, in a motion that felt like winter folding over the land, some of the 30 loosened. Their forms became less shadow and more bone, and where their eyes had burned there came a softness. One by one, a handful stepped forward and, without sound, walked into the thing at the center. The cavern did not consume them violently. It received them like a tide that had finally been named and led back to its home. Their faces, when they turned toward me, were not angry but relieved, as if a burden had been lifted. Others remained, tethered still, their outlines flickering with fear and hope both. I will not say I felt no pain because the bargain demanded it. The earth took not only those who stepped willingly, it marked me as well. The imprint on my forearm, the blackened hand, seared and then burned down into bone. Time in that cavern folded. I saw images of the suits, the men who'd cut deals, who'd stamped documents and shut mouths, and I felt an old, patient intelligence marking them as well, a ledger beyond mere paper. I stumbled out of that pit with soil in my hair and names on my tongue, and the air above was different, tilting in small ways. Birds dared to land. The hum was softer, leashed like a dog at one's heel. Some of the 30 were gone. Some remained. The balance was not perfect, and perhaps it never could be. I did as I had vowed. I took the journals, the ledger, the torn papers, and the photographs, and I drove to the city. I gave them to a reporter whose eyes did not look away. I bore the evidence to a judge willing to read a stranger's madness as if it might hide truth. I told the story of 30 men who had gone to work and never come back, and of a company that had buried more than dirt. Newspapers printed the ledgers and the names. It did not erase the pain of the families nor the silence of those who had been paid to forget, but it cracked the shell of convenient amnesia the town had lived in for decades. People came to the valley, some with candles, some with cameras, some with the empty curiosity of tourists. The suits, when confronted, did not become monsters on the page, but men with tremors and stuttered explanations, and that human frailty made their culpability all the more ordinary and all the more condemnable. What I could not repair, I tried to remember. I wrote until the ink dried into a patina on my hands. I left copies of the journals, bound and boxed, in the loose compartment of an old garage I had known since boyhood, the same garage where Dwyer had first hidden his shame. I placed helmets on the shelf, wrapped in oilcloth, and I stacked the ledger where a curious hand might find it in decades to come. I left instructions carved into the wood. If you find this, read it aloud. Say their names. I could not rescue all 30. I could not bring back every laughter and every life. But I could make sure they were no longer a story whispered under breath. I could make them counted. When the tremors returned years later, because the earth keeps its hunger and memory only muffles it, the mark on my arm flared and the voices came back, softer now, like a chorus in the distance. I knew I had not finished. That knowledge sat with me like a patient companion. But there is a dignity in small victories. The families who found closure, the town that stopped looking away, the names that would not be lost between property deeds and contracted silence. I grew older. My hair went thin. I found a piece of sorts in the work of testimony. The last thing I did before I could no longer write with steady hands was wrap the final journal in oilcloth and tuck it behind the loose panel in that garage wall, exactly where I had once torn it from the wood to show Dwyer. I left a note that read, simply, "We dug too deep. Tell them. If you are holding these words, if you have pried at the wood and found the journals, if you have read the names and traced the ledger and felt, against any sensible inclination, a pull of pity, then know this. Some things are ancient and do not answer our pleas. They do not reason with us, nor bargain in the currency of law. But names are a strange thing. They are small torches in vast dark places. They cannot undo what was done, but they can make the debt visible. That visibility is a kind of mercy. I paid part of the price with my nights, my health, and the peace of my mind. Others paid with life in ways I cannot fathom. I do not pretend to have been brave. I only carried what was given to me until I could give it away. And so the story closes and begins again, for the valley keeps its rhythms, and men keep their hunger. If you choose to pry open the hatch and peer into that black, do not expect a neat ending. Expect instead the persistence of what we bury, the stubbornness of secrets that will not die simply because we want them to. Expect names and tell them. Expect to be marked. Expect to be changed. If, in the end, I found a measure of peace, it was in the knowledge that 30 voices now have witnesses, and that for as long as someone reads their names aloud, they cannot be forgotten.